would say I spend a good 50% of my day thinking about sewing patterns, so I am extremely excited to yap to you about them today. If you've ever wondered what the heck a sewing pattern is, we will cover that today, but if you already are somewhat familiar with them, I still feel like I have some good tips and insights to give you. I've been sewing for about 10-ish years and I'm self-taught, and so the first probably 6 or 7 years that I was sewing, I did not use sewing patterns because they felt intimidating and sort of confusing to me, or at least I felt like I would be confused by them because I was nervous that I wouldn't understand the things they were talking about because I'm self-taught. So it took me a long time to try them. And now, not only do I use sewing patterns all the time, but I have made some of my own. So I feel extremely qualified to coach you guys through this today. Basically, my goal is to give you the guide that I wish I had when I took my first foray into sewing patterns. This is also episode 4 in my whole Learn to Sew series. In episode 1, we talked about all of the sewing tools that I would recommend, including machines. In episode 2, we did a deep dive into fabric shopping, what fabric to use for different projects. In episode 3, we talked about how to use your sewing machine. It was like a full tour of all of the pieces and elements and even sergers. Obviously today, we're talking about sewing patterns. And then episode 5, we get to actually sew a beginner project. It's gonna be super beginner friendly. If you've never sewn anything before, it was made for you. Probably gonna be a tote bag. To be completely honest, I haven't planned that out exactly or practiced what I'm gonna make, so I'll probably just wing it, but it's gonna be fun and cute. You can trust me. Okay, what is a sewing pattern? Essentially, it's a comprehensive guide that gives you all the information you need to make a specific garment or item. I'll probably be referencing clothes more today because that's the type of sewing patterns that I sew with a lot and the ones I'll be recommending. But obviously there are also patterns for like accessories and curtains and home goods and all sorts of things. So patterns include 2 key elements. First of which is the physical pattern pieces, the actual shapes of the clothing or whatnot that you are going to cut out. And then the second element is the instructions, the actual step-by-step guide of how to construct your garment. So as for the physical pattern pieces that you use to cut on your fabric, there are 2 different ways you can go about it, one of which is a physical sewing pattern. Those would come in little packets like this. These are the Harleen dungarees from Merchant and Mills and the only physical pattern that I own, so it's gonna be my example today. But it comes in a little packet like this. It's a folder that opens up, and inside there are these like tissue paper-like pattern pieces. So here's one pattern piece, for example. You can hear it's kind of like a crinkly paper. So because the patterns come in obviously lots of different sizes, you need to cut out your specific size. So you can see there are different lines here for the different sizes. And what I've done is I highlighted my size. You can see there's a little bit of leftover pink highlighter there. I highlighted my size and then cut out all my pattern pieces on that specific line. But the way that some people do it is they lay out the whole pattern uncut and highlight their size and then trace over it in a different translucent paper, tissue paper like this. And that way it preserves all the sizes exactly as they are, so that if you want to go back and make a bigger size or redraw some of the lines or whatnot, you have the preserved pattern piece. It's a bit of extra effort and that's why I didn't do it, but it is an option. So up to you whether you want to directly cut out the pattern pieces or trace them. And then also for the physical patterns, they come with physically printed out instructions as well, which have the step-by-step directions, illustrations, all the information you need there. So historically, that is what sewing patterns were and are. Nowadays, I feel like it is very popular and perhaps more popular, at least in my world view, to sew with PDF patterns, which basically means instead of purchasing a physical packet like that, you get emailed PDF files that include all the pattern pieces and the instructions that way. I definitely prefer PDF patterns and we'll go through all of the elements there, but mostly I love them just because you can keep track of everything better, right? You have those digital files forever that you can go back to the originals, reprint things, etc. So PDF patterns also have the physical pattern pieces and instructions, but because it's a file, a digital file, you need to print the pattern pieces on your own. So there are 3 different methods to print or get those physical pattern pieces that you need. And I will give the caveat that not all PDF pattern makers are made equal. Not everybody includes all the different formats, so definitely read descriptions before you purchase online patterns to make sure they come with the format that you want. So the first format and the traditional way to print your pattern is to print it at home on your home computer. And you may be thinking, how do I print like a big pant leg pattern piece on my home printer? So what the print at home PDF file will be is it's basically like a puzzle where the giant file with all the pattern pieces are broken up into individual pages that you need to piece together yourself. And then once it's all taped together like a big puzzle, then you can cut out all the individual pattern pieces after that. It might sound kind of intimidating or time consuming. It can be slightly time consuming, but it's also kind of fun and relaxing. I love to just pop in like an audiobook and get to taping all my pages. And I promise once you've done one, it's pretty easy. I also have a full video tutorial just about how to print and tape together your pattern pieces, so I'll link that if you want to watch all the details. But a couple things I will mention that are very important to pay attention to. Make sure you're printing at 100% scale. A lot of the time, a printer defaults to fit on the page instead of having the scale be actual size or 100%. But it's very important because obviously the measurements for the pattern pieces themselves are extremely important. You don't want them to be too big or too small. So make sure you're printing at 100% scale, and typically, almost always, on the print at home file, there will be like a test square. It's just a random square that has its measurements. Like for my test squares, they're 2 inches, or I have a square that's 5 centimeters. So when you print out the first page, make sure that square is exactly 2 inches, or the 5 centimeter square is exactly 5 centimeters, because if it's not, that means the rest of the scale of the entire pattern is going to be off. So check your scale. And if you don't have a printer at home, which I did not have a printer at home until like 6 months ago, check out your local library. I used to print my patterns at the library, and it's really pretty cheap. I feel like the first few pages are free, and then after that it was like 10 cents a page. So printing my patterns was usually like a couple dollars at most. So that's printing at home. If you do not want to print at home, you can also print large format, which is formatted for A0 size paper. Think like those big rolls of like architect paper, right? Or like giant posters. Those are A0 size. So a lot of PDF patterns, or the good patterns, will have a print at home file and also a large format A0 file. So if you want to print it that way, use that file, not the print at home file. And you obviously have to get that printed somewhere that has a large scale printer. My favorite place to print large format is called pdfplotting.com. Their whole business model is set up to print patterns basically. So they make it extremely easy for you. And it's relatively cheap too. I think it's like $3 a page, and usually it's like 1 to 3 pages. So $3 to $9 to print. However, you do have to pay for shipping on PDF plotting, which can get sort of expensive, but the way I do it is I just make sure to print a few patterns at a time, and then I'm not paying as much per pattern. And their shipping's quick too. So PDF plotting, my favorite place to print large format patterns. If you want something printed same day, I know some sewing shops print large format. If you're lucky enough to have one in your area who does that, I'm jealous of you, and that's amazing. Kind of a case-by-case basis though. But you can also get it printed at a local copy shop. I would recommend going into like a mom and pop type shop, like a place where the people there know about printing, they totally know what they're doing and will be nice and help you. Because definitely anywhere you're going to get something printed, the majority of the time they're not printing sewing patterns, they're printing other types of things. And so what you're asking for might be sort of foreign, and I'd rather talk to like a nice person who's willing to help you than like a random teenager at Staples who doesn't know what they're doing. That's probably biased, and if you work at Staples, you probably know all about printing, but I did try once to print something, I think at like an Office Depot, but the way it was set up was super confusing, and once I figured out how to order it, it ended up being very expensive, and so I just scrapped it and printed it at PDF plotting. And then there is a third magical way to get your physical pattern pieces, and that is with a projector. Projector sewing is getting very popular, and I fully plan on getting a projector very soon. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. But essentially you use a projector to project the pattern pieces directly onto your fabric. So there's no paper, you don't have to spend time printing anything. You just cut directly onto your fabric with like the projected image. It's so cool. Because I don't have a projector yet, I can't recommend specific ones to you. I need to do a bit more research to find what projector I'm going to get. But I know there is a Facebook group for projector sewing, which I'll link in the description, that I've heard is extremely helpful. I also get the impression that if you're going to get a projector, it's probably only worth it if you sew a ton and probably have your own dedicated sewing space as well. Part of the reason I've put it off so long is because I've only recently had a dedicated sewing space. I built this, what, August, July, June, like 4 months ago? And before that, I was sewing on my dining room table. So every time I was gonna sew anything, I had to get all my stuff out and then put all my stuff back because it's like in the middle of my family's business. So using a projector wouldn't be super smart because I know you have to calibrate it. And if you move the projector or the table or whatever, you have to recalibrate everything every time, which I've heard is time consuming. And so ideally you want a space where the projector stays where it's going to be, it's not going to be bumped by people all the time, and a table that stays where it's going to be as well. I now have that, so I need to figure it out. This is me verbally committing to getting a projector as soon as possible. So those are the 3 methods: print at home, large format, and projector. I would say any PDF pattern will come with a print at home file, some will come with large format, and I think projector files are becoming more popular, but I wouldn't rely on every PDF pattern you see to have a projector file. So again, read the descriptions. My patterns do have all 3 of those though. And then of course there are the instructions. So for the physical patterns, they come pre-printed and whatnot, and PDF patterns, the instructions are a separate file. I personally don't print my instructions when I use PDF patterns just because I don't want to use the paper, and I find it pretty easy to just have my computer next to me and I can look through the instructions that way. But there is a ton of information in the instructions. It's not just step-by-step construction, it also includes so many other things. So we're gonna go through the basic elements that you should find in your pattern instructions. First of all, there is a ton of sizing and measurement information in your instructions. So there will be a sizing chart that will help you determine what size of the pattern you're going to make. And I cannot stress this enough, every size chart is different. Choose your size based on your measurements, right? So it will list like bust measurements, waist measurements, hip measurements. Literally measure your body and choose based on your size. Do not choose based on what size you usually are in other size charts. I don't want you to be worried about, is this in US sizing or European sizing or Australian sizing? That could not be less relevant. My sizes are numeric, like they have numbers associated with them. My sizing is size 0 through 34, so I have an 18 size range. It goes like 0, 2, 4, 6, up to 34. But my sizes could be named like colors. Like I could have size yellow, size green, size blue. They could be named after flowers. You know, it's completely arbitrary. What you need to focus on. Am I ranting too much about this? I just feel so passionately about it because people will be like, well, I'm usually a size 8 in my Abercrombie jeans. And then they'll choose a size 8 in a pattern, and when it doesn't fit them, they'll be confused. And it's like, you didn't measure your body. Okay. Okay, I'm fine. Essentially, you are making a garment to fit your body. So make sure you measure your body when choosing what size to make. Okay? You'll do it. I trust you. I do have a couple tips for you, however, in choosing your size, because I know it's intimidating sometimes to choose your size. You don't want to get it wrong and spend all the time making the thing to have it not fit. So, a couple tips for you. First of all, pay attention to the intended design. So, in all of my patterns, I have a page that details out how the garment is meant to fit your body. Is it supposed to be oversized? Is it supposed to be snug around your bust but loose on your waist? You know, I'll tell you kind of how it's designed so that you can decide if you want to go with your straight size, if you want to size up or size down or whatnot. Because it also depends on how you like your garments to fit, right? For example, I have a pattern, my lane pants pattern. All my patterns are kind of oversized. I like very like loose, flowy clothes. That's how I like clothes to fit my body. So when I design clothes, I design them to be very loose fitting, right? Some people don't like that. That's totally fine. It's just personal preference. So my lane pants are quite flowy. They're very like wide leg. There's a lot of ease in the hips. They're fitted to the waist because they're an elastic waistband. I'm like wearing them right now. Anyways, so they're fitted to your waist, very loose in the hips, very loose in the legs. I detail all this out in the pattern, right? I tell you how it's meant to fit. If you like pants to be more snug in your hips, in your legs, whatever, I would probably recommend that you size down, right? Because it's meant to be very oversized. But I do understand it can be hard to gauge exactly how oversized or how snug something is going to be. So I also include the finished garment measurements in my patterns as well. Not all patterns might have them, but I know a lot of them do. So there's the measurement chart that tells you exactly what size your body is. And then there's the finished garment measurement chart, and that will tell you when you've completely made your garment, what measurements are at each of these places. So I'm gonna do a quick example to kind of show you what I mean. I have my tape measure here. I'm going to use my Skyline dress as an example. This top is actually from my Skyline dress pattern, so I feel like it will kind of help make sense of what we're doing here. So for this pattern in particular, the only measurement that you need to take is your bust measurement, because below the bust, it just flares out a ton. And so your waist and your hip measurements won't really affect what size you choose. So I'm going to first measure my bust exactly what it is. All right, I'm measuring it at the full bust, not the under bust. Also, it might not be super duper accurate because I'm wearing sort of a flowy shirt, but it's close enough. Okay, my full bust is 35.5 inches. So on my size chart, a bust measurement of 35.5 would land me in a size 6. But if I go down to the finished garment measurement chart, I can see that when the dress is finished, the bust area of that dress will be 41.5 inches. So that tells me that the difference between my actual bust measurement and the finished bust area of the dress is going to be 5.6 inches. So you can kind of conceptualize how much area that's going to be, right? Like 5.5-ish inches is not going to be a super tight fitting garment, right? But an even better way to conceptualize this is to literally take your tape measure, pull it out to the size that says. So for me, 41.5 inches. I'm gonna put it around myself and kind of hold it there in a circle. And I can see how roomy that's actually going to be. Now, I like it. I like that it's quite roomy. That sounds good to me. I'll make a size 6. If that feels too big to you or too tight to you, like let's say I wanted a roomy garment, but when I go to see the finished garment measurements, it's like tight on me, then I'll know, okay, I'm definitely gonna size up, right? So that's why the finished garment measurements are in there. It's to help you determine what size you want to make. And I'm gonna be honest, that's the type of thing I would have skipped over before I started actually making my own sewing patterns. And now I realize how valuable that information actually is. So don't sleep on that. Now, if you are in between sizes, so for example, if your waist measurement and hip measurement lands you on 2 different places on a size chart, like your hips are in a size 16, but your waist is in a size 10, and you're like, well, what size do I make? Super common question. Everybody's bodies are different. I wouldn't expect you to land exactly in one size if your size chart is taking into account multiple points of your body, right? So my bit of advice is to pay attention to what measurements are most important in the pattern and most important to you. We're going to use my Lane pants as an example. It actually is a good example because I do fall in between sizes on that size chart. My hips would put me at a size 12 and my waist would put me at a size 8. So not like a huge difference, but just thinking through those measurements, which of those are important, I would definitely lean more toward my hip measurement, mostly because I care a lot about how much ease is in my hip area. I'm quite pear-shaped, and so I find traditionally fitting clothing that technically doesn't fit anyone perfectly. Anyway, usually pants give me a huge gap in the back of the waist. I know that's a common problem for a lot of people. So for me, I care the most about making sure that my hips have enough ease. And then because it is an elastic waistband, I can make a size 10 or a size 12 to fit my hips better, but then I can cut the elastic down to the size that a size 8 would be, and that kind of meshes the 2 sizes together, right? Does that make sense? So just depending on what pattern you're doing, what measurements are important to you, you kind of just need to think through what's the best way to go about it. So that's an easy solution because because there's an elastic waistband, if there's no such thing in the pattern you're doing, you can also grade between sizes. Basically what that means is literally just drawing a line between two sizes. So for example, if you're making a top that is somewhat form-fitting, right? And your bust measurement and waist measurement are in between two sizes. Let's say you're in between a size 4 and size 8. There will be a line to cut for size 4 and a line to cut for size 8. Let's say your bust is an 8 and your waist is a 4. All you would need to do is draw a line from the size 8 at the bust point to a 4 at the waist point and kind of redraw that line so that it's grading in between the two sizes. If that sounds super confusing to you, I wouldn't worry too much about it, and maybe until you have a few patterns under your belt and feel a tad more comfortable. But if you are super duper paralyzed by choosing a size and like so afraid you're gonna get it wrong, my recommendation would be to sew up a toile first, which is basically like a practice garment. It's best to make it in kind of like a cheap or thrifted fabric, something that you're not too worried if it doesn't work out. And if it does work out and it's wearable, that's wonderful, but you can kind of make it just to test out the fit so that when you cut into your really good fabric, you know with a certainty if it's going to fit or not. Pattern instructions also have a lot of information about fabric. Most importantly is the fabric requirements, which is a chart that tells you how much fabric you need for your size in this specific pattern. Oftentimes there will also be different fabric requirements for the different widths of fabric you're using as well. If you don't know a ton about fabric widths, we talked about it in depth on episode 2, my fabric deep dive, so you can jump over there. But essentially different bolts of fabric come in different widths. And so if you're using a bolt of fabric that is 60 inches wide, you won't need to buy as much length as you would in a bolt that is 44 inches wide, for example. So if you see like 60-inch W or 44-inch W, that's what that means. That's the width of the fabric. And keep in mind that the fabric requirements are the exact minimum amount of fabric you would need. So I personally always buy a smidge extra, probably, I don't know, I would buy at least a half a yard extra. That's just me. But I would hate to accidentally cut something wrong or have my fabric shrink a lot more than I thought it would when I pre-washed it and not have enough fabric and need to go buy more. I've done that enough times that I've learned my lesson. So for me personally, I always buy a little bit more than the pattern says to buy. And I always find use for my scraps as well, so I'm not super worried about having leftover. In addition to how much fabric you need, the pattern will also tell you if there's any other notions you need, like zippers or snaps or bias tape or anything like that. And don't forget about that, because there's nothing worse than like making a bag and getting to a step and being like, now insert your zipper, and it's like, I forgot to buy a zipper. So make sure you read the notions carefully. And then I always include in my patterns recommendations for types of fabric. I think a lot of patterns do that, but they'll tell you if it should be a certain kind of fabric. And I think my patterns in particular are quite flexible with the types of fabric that you use. It kind of just changes the vibe of your garment, but there are some patterns that are quite specific with the weight of the fabric you need or the content of the fabric. So if your pattern tells you that, don't ignore it. I also have a couple patterns where there are certain fabrics that I would not recommend. For example, this top, actually, I say in it that I don't recommend gauze, because if you're making this like little bias tape here, it can be really tricky to make it with gauze. But I've had people make it in gauze and then email me and be like, I'm having such a hard time with my bias tape, like any tips? And they're like making it in gauze, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's kind of a tricky choice you made there. So just a tip. There's probably also printing instructions in the pattern, often including a printing layout as well. So like we talked about tiling those print at home papers all together, there's usually in the instructions one big picture of the full layout done. That's kind of like your key or your map when you're doing the puzzle. And then of course there are the step-by-step instructions, the actual illustrations and detailed steps you need to construct your garment. And then I always include video tutorials as well in all of my patterns, which are linked in the instructions. There's a couple patterns of mine where there's a couple steps that are like a little bit trickier to get just by words and illustrations alone. So I'll link like in that step, I'll be like, if you're having trouble, like jump over to the video tutorial. I find it really helpful just to watch somebody else do it. So my patterns all have video tutorials. I think there are quite a few that do. Not all patterns have them, but I think it's usually listed in like the description of a pattern before you buy it, if it has a video tutorial or not. And that's another thing I love about PDF patterns especially. It makes it really easy to link that kind of stuff. So those are the general elements that you can find in almost all sewing patterns. There are sometimes a few extra little stuff just depending on the type of pattern or different things the patterns require. I know for every pattern I've made, there's always a couple extra things that I throw in to certain patterns that I feel like are helpful. So that is what is in the instructions. I also wanted to go over pattern markings. So on the actual pattern pieces, there are all these different symbols and markings that would probably be confusing if it's your first time ever using a pattern. So we are going to walk through what they all are, what they all mean, and how important they are. We already talked about cutting lines, which are all the different lines on the pattern where you actually cut out your size. Pretty self-explanatory. Cutting line, you cut the pattern there. There are other lines on the pattern called grain lines. Here's an example here of a grain line. You can see this vertical line that has arrows at the top and the bottom. That is the grain line. And what that means is that tells you what direction the grain of your fabric should be going. All right, I've grabbed an example here. So this is a bolt of fabric. On one side of the fabric, there is going to be this edge called selvage. And it looks like it's woven a little bit differently. It has kind of these frayed-ish edges here. So that is your selvage edge of your fabric. And you want the grain line that you're cutting your fabric on to be parallel to the selvage edge. If I was cutting this pattern piece on this fabric, I would want the grain line to be going up and down parallel to the selvage. Some pattern pieces need to be cut on the grain. Some pattern pieces would be cut cross grain, which would be if you're cutting up and down here and the selvage edge is here like perpendicular, that's cross grain. And then some patterns need to be cut on the bias, which is at a 45-degree angle from the selvage edge. And on the grain, cross grain, and bias to the grain all produce kind of different effects. So if you cut a pattern piece on the bias that is supposed to be on the grain, it's going to behave differently. So pay attention to that grain line. I know sometimes it's tempting to kind of tilt your pattern pieces to make them fit a little bit better on the fabric, but you need to be cutting them on their grain line. I'm going to be cutting out some fabric in a minute and showing you tips for cutting out pattern pieces. So we'll talk more about selvage and grain lines and bias and all that stuff then. Another marking on patterns are notches. And notches look a little bit different on every pattern. Sometimes they're triangles. For my patterns, they're little lines. You can see this notch right here. And basically what that means is you need to mark that on your pattern because it's marking an important part of the pattern that will come up in the construction. So when you're cutting out your pattern pieces, you need to make sure you're cutting any notches that are marked. For me, I do my notches the easy/lazy way, and I literally just cut a teeny tiny snip there. And I make my notches on my patterns quite small because you don't want to cut too far into your fabric, right? Because then there might be holes in construction. You just want to do a teeny tiny snip, maybe about 1/4 of an inch. Like I said, sometimes notches are triangles. I know some people cut their notches out in triangles. Sometimes they cut their notches out in inverted triangles, which basically just means the triangle is not poking into the pattern piece, but kind of pokes out of the pattern piece. To me, that's a lot of work to solve something that in my opinion isn't really a problem. But hey, do it the way you want to do it. So those are notches. Another pattern marking is darts. So a dart would be in a bodice of a pattern piece, and it kind of looks like a little pizza shape almost, a little pie. It's this triangle here. But the way that a dart functions in construction is that you fold these lines together so that they touch, and it gives your bodice a bit more of a rounded shape at the bust to fit people's bodies better. So when you are cutting your fabric and there's a dart on the pattern piece, you need to mark the dart. So these are not lines to cut, they're lines to mark. That's why this line is very haggard and kind of falling apart, is because I've marked on top of it many, many times. The way that I mark my darts is with a Hera marker. This is a Hera marker. It's just like a little piece of plastic that comes to a not really sharp, but fine point, so that when you mark the fabric, it leaves a crease on that line. I love my Hera marker. An alternate to this would be like chalk or tailor's pens. I know you can buy chalk and pens and things like that that wash out of fabric. I like a hair marker because it doesn't actually leave any ink or chalk, it's just a crease and you can still see it. So when I'm cutting this pattern piece out, I just mark over top of the little pizza shape to mark it into the fabric. So that's a dart, that's how you mark it. We also have a fold line. So you can see here, there's this little like bracket shaped line that says cut on fold. For pattern pieces that have this, instead of cutting all the way around this edge and cutting on this line, you fold the fabric over in half and lay this pattern piece on the fold. There are also random dots and shapes on patterns that you need to mark. They're a little bit different on every pattern. So I'm going to show you on this one for an example. You can see these little asterisk star shaped shapes. And basically the purpose of those is to mark that place. So you see I cut a size 12, and so I marked the little star shape here that is a size 12, and I've poked a little hole into it. So anywhere that your pattern has little shapes like this to mark, you want to mark that with a little chalk or pen or something like that. For something like this, you can't really use a hair marker. When I do it, I just take like a random colored pencil or something I have because I'm a little bit lazy with it sometimes. I just find the closest thing to me that will mark something discreetly. But markings like that, shapes, dots like that, in the construction of the garment, they will need to match up to something or they'll reference something. And so you want to make sure that you are marking those and not forgetting about them, because if you do forget about them, which I have done many times, you'll have to get your pattern pieces back out, lay it back on top of the piece that you cut, find that marking, redo that marking. So when you're actually cutting your pattern pieces, really scan the whole pattern piece and make sure you're not missing anything like that. Some patterns will also have lengthen or shorten lines, which are lines that cut kind of through the middle of a pattern piece. For this is a back of a vest or like kind of like a bodice piece. So these lines in particular are cut lines if you want a cropped version versus a long version. There are details for that in instructions, so make sure you're reading through the instructions. I would recommend definitely reading through the instructions before you cut your pattern pieces, just so you're not missing any of the special markings on pattern pieces. These lines in particular are for cropping your vest, but there are often lines cutting through pattern pieces like this that are for lengthening or shortening your pattern pieces as well. The last couple markings we'll go over are buttons and buttonholes. So again, buttons are marked slightly different on different patterns. For this pattern, we have a button right here. It's marked with another little star thing, but it says on it button, so you know that's for a button. I also have this pattern here where I've marked the buttons with actual circles to kind of show where those buttons are going to be. And then buttonholes are often kind of short lines. This one, for example, is a line with a star at the end, or sometimes it'll be a line with like two brackets on the end, and that will be your buttonhole. So you want to mark things like that as well. You may see a theme here, which is to mark all the markings. Those are all of the basic pattern markings that you will likely see. Sometimes there are random other markings, but if we didn't cover them here, they're likely somewhat unique, and the instructions should have details on what they mean, how to mark them, how to cut them, whatnot. It's time for us to cut some fabric. So we are going to go over cutting fabric in general, but also some tips and tricks that I have found for cutting pieces of your pattern. So first and foremost, I always cut my fabric in a single layer, not folded. When fabric comes on a bolt, it comes folded in half. See the crease here of where it's folded, but it's much more fabric efficient to cut in a single layer. And a lot of patterns have cutting layouts, like their recommended way to lay your pattern pieces on the fabric when you're cutting, and usually that is depicted cut on the fold. The reason that I do not do that in my patterns, and the reason that I do not cut on the fold, is because it wastes a lot of fabric. Especially because for every size and every width of fabric, there will be a different configuration that will save the most fabric. So for me, I have 18 sizes and I calculate fabric requirements for 3 standard widths, like on the bolt. So just calculating those 3 fabric widths and 18 sizes, that gives you, gosh, I don't have a calculator, like 50 something, I think, combinations. But then there are even more combinations for other fabric widths that aren't like those 3 standard sizes. Basically, if I gave you a uniform way to lay out your pattern pieces on the fabric, it's not going to be the most efficient way for your specific situation. And so it's better overall for you to just Tetris the pieces around a little bit and find exactly the most efficient way to cut it for you. So it just takes a little time on your end, but I'll give you my tips for how I always configure my pattern pieces and how I cut mine. Tip number 1 is to always cut the biggest pattern pieces first. So if you have skirt pieces, for example, that's probably going to be your biggest piece. I would cut skirts first, biggest pattern pieces first. The pattern that I am cutting today is my ruby vest pattern. I'm going to make like a denim quilted vest. It's going to be cute. And so my biggest pattern piece is going to be the back of the vest. Pattern markings that I want to pay attention to on this pattern piece: it is cut on the fold, which is marked here. This is the grain line, which we want to be parallel to the selvage edge. This here is the selvage edge of the fabric, so we want that to be parallel. And then I have lines here for a cropped version. I cut it full length, but I actually do want it cropped. So I'm gonna fold this. I am actually very glad that I remembered that. So because this is going to be cut on the fold, I need to fold my fabric just in the place where I'm cutting this pattern piece. Looks about right. My cutting setup is on a cutting mat with a grid and a rotary cutter, which I swear by. It's my favorite way to cut fabric by far. I also use pattern weights, which are just heavy things to place on top of your pattern piece so they don't move as you're cutting. These specific ones I love, and I wish I could link them. I got them in like a kit, and I cannot find similar ones anywhere else. I don't know, maybe I just haven't looked hard enough. But I only recently have been using these over the past few months, and before that I would literally just grab random things in the room I was in, like candles or my scissors or whatever, to weigh the pattern down. So you don't absolutely need pattern weights, they're just helpful. Okay, so I've lined this pattern piece up. I have the fold along this edge. I have my pattern weights on. I have also lined it up with the grid. I find that personally helpful, but it isn't absolutely necessary. So I'm just gonna take my rotary cutter and cut it out. All right, there is our first pattern piece. Beautimous. The next pattern piece is the front of the vest. So you can see here it tells you how many you need to cut and in what way. So this says we're gonna cut 2 mirrored. Mirrored means they're mirror images of each other, right? Because a vest, you would need one side that looks like this and one side mirrored. You don't want to cut 2 pieces the same direction. Does that make sense? So I'm going to cut the first one around the curve here. This is fitting in nicely so that it won't be wasting much fabric. And again, this grain line, we want to be parallel to the selvage edge. I wouldn't be crazy particular about getting this like exactly parallel, not 1 degree tilted. Just do your best. As long as it's not like crazy ski-wampus, you're gonna be fine. I just realized I need to cut this line shorter. This one can't be folded because of the curve. I'm just gonna cut it, but then I'll save this bottom portion for any time I want to make it full length vest. Also, don't murder me. These are technically fabric scissors, but I am cutting paper with them. I'm just not super particular. Don't come for me, it's fine. I probably don't care a ton because I very rarely use my fabric scissors for actually cutting my fabric. I use my rotary cutter for my fabric, and these don't get quite as much use, so maybe that's why I'm more lax about it. Okay, so I'm going to cut this out. The only other thing I want to pay attention to is this notch here, and when I get to the notch, I'm literally just going to give it a little slice with my rotary cutter. Okay, perfect. I know some people find that dicey just to do like a teeny rotary cutter notch because you can very easily go too far. I trust myself, so I do it that way, but you can use your scissors if you're nervous. So there's one piece of the front. You can see the little notch there. I should probably mention, you should iron your fabric before you cut into it. This has been ironed all except for this center fold here. I am not too worried about it. I don't think that that fold messed my cutting up at all. If your whole bolt of fabric is like super wrinkly, it will kind of mess up your pattern pieces, but this one crease in the center, I don't think messed anything up. I had it all weighted down and everything, so it's totally fine. Don't judge me. Sometimes there are folds in your fabric and it's fine. All right, we just need one other front vest piece. Okay, so we're gonna lay it face down this time because it's mirrored. So we could do it that way. I feel good about that. We'll get a little scrap here and possibly a scrap here, but overall, it's pretty good. Now we have two vest pieces. This is making me very excited. I have big plans for this vest. It's gonna be so cute. Oh, I just realized I forgot the notch on this one. No worries, I'm just gonna lay down pattern piece. I'm glad I remembered now and not when I was actually sewing it. Line it all up, and I can see my little cut here where I cut the first notch. Ta-da! No sweat, everything's fine. I should also mention, it does say on here we're cutting 2 of the main fabric and 2 of the lining fabric. I haven't decided what my lining fabric is going to be. We're not going to cut that today. We're just doing the main fabric as an example. But the last pattern piece that we need to cut are the ties. So my vest is going to have a little tie here. That's where the notch is. It's marking like where the tie is going to be. So I need to cut 2 of these. You can see this grain line is at a 45-degree angle, which means that it's going to be cut on the bias, which is very exciting. This is also where I find my grid to be especially helpful. So you can see here, my grid has a 45-degree angle line and a 30-degree angle line. This is also a 45-degree angle line. It says 90 because it's 90 degrees from this 45 degree. You get it. I think I'm going to cut them as close to this corner as we can get. So I'm going to lay my straight edge at a 45-degree angle following this line on my grid, just to double check. Okay, that'll be good. So I'm going to shift my pattern weights around a little bit as I'm cutting this to make sure that this stays nice and flat. I'm going to use my straight edge on this side. There's one. And there's 2. So I didn't even explain the reason why some pieces of your pattern are going to be cut at a bias is because the bias of the grain line has a bit of stretch to it. So the grain and the cross grain don't have any stretch to them, but woven fabrics like this, woven cottons, have a bit of stretch on the bias. So the reason that ties are cut on the bias like this is because that stretch gives them a bit more fluidity to them. They curve more easily. So if I'm going to be tying these into ties, they're going to lay more nicely because they were cut on the bias. So a lot of times ties, things like neckline bindings, straps, those are often cut on the bias. There are also like skirts and dresses that are cut on the bias that have like a really nice drape to them. So you definitely don't want to cut pieces that are intended for the bias on the grain or cross grain. They're gonna come out not as intended. So from those 3 pieces, these are all of the scraps we have. There's basically none. I did, however, just remember I was going to make the binding of the vest also out of this denim. So in this pattern, this is my ruby vest pattern. In this pattern, I have instructions for doing a continuous binding, which is kind of like a tricky, fancy way to do it. I'm just going to cut a bunch of strips of fabric on the bias and kind of Frankenstein them together. That's the way I kind of do things on the fly. So really quickly, I'm just gonna cut a bunch more strips here on the bias. All right, friends, all of those strips have been cut. I just need to figure out what lining fabric I'm going to use for the vest. I'm so excited about it though, so stay tuned. I'll have to show you when it's finished. A couple last things I wanted to talk to you about though. Most importantly, how to store your patterns. So my storage system that I'm gonna show you, I've been using for basically the entire time I've been using patterns. I think at this point, I could maybe think of a better way to do it because I have like a whole dedicated sewing space. So maybe there's some room for improvement, but the way that I have always stored them was born from a lack of space. I've always lived in pretty small places. I have kids, you know, I have a family, so I couldn't have my patterns out willy-nilly. So the way that I've always stored them is I keep them folded up in files. So I have this like file box that I got at Target a couple years ago, I think. And I had like a file folder thing I used before this that just kind of fell apart. But essentially inside is files of all of the sewing patterns that I have. I used these like manila folders that have a clasp on them, and I would just write on each one what it was. So this one says lane A0, which means the lane pants pattern, printed large formats, just all folded up inside of here. So I used these originally, and my hope and dream was to like print a picture of what everything was on the outside with like a cute little graphic or something. And I really should have known myself better that that's not something I was really gonna prioritize. So I've just written on all of them what they are. But then the last time I was at the store to get more of these, they were like out of these specific kind of folders. So I just got like regular file folders like this, thinking they'd kind of be a step down. But I actually like these ones more. They're just more accessible and easy to grab. Like if I just want like one pattern piece out of something, if I just want to grab something really quick, these are really nice to grab pattern pieces out of, especially because they can kind of just sit in here and I can sift through them and grab out what I need to grab. I can easily see how they're labeled. I don't have to actually like pull them out to read each individual thing. So maybe I'll upgrade them all to be these files. I don't know, that's kind of a waste of these old folders I used to use. I'll probably just keep doing what I've been doing. It's been working for me, I like it. I have 3 of these boxes total. One of them are my patterns. You can see I've labeled them my patterns. These are ones that I've designed myself. And then I have another box that is other designers' patterns that I have printed and organized. And then I have a third box that is full of kids' patterns that I designed back in the day when I used to have a kids' handmade clothing shop. And my plan is to someday make those official patterns available to you guys as well. So that is how I store my patterns. I like the system. I feel like it's a good system. The only thing that's maybe sort of annoying about it is the first time you have to fold the pattern pieces up, it's kind of annoying, but I don't even find it annoying like when you unfold the pattern to cut it, there's like creases in the paper. I am fine with that. I haven't had an issue there. I know some people don't like having creases in their pattern pieces. Couple other methods I have heard of. I know some people hang their pattern pieces like in a closet. They hang them up flat. And the way you do that is you punch a hole in each pattern piece and then put it like a metal hook, like an S hook. Can you picture what I'm describing? I'll put a picture here. But you put a little hook through the pattern and hang them all flat. I've seen people do that. That is an option. Might not be an option if you don't have a space for that. Or in my case, my kids would have ripped them all down. So I've never pursued that method, but it's a valid one. I've also seen people roll their pattern pieces. Like if you always print your patterns large format, and so they're big pattern pieces, you can keep them all in rolls and then secure the rolls with like a ribbon or something like that. People will put them in cute like baskets and have all of the patterns rolled up in the basket. I think that's really cute. I feel like rolled paper bothers me more than creased paper, so that's something to consider. Maybe you're the other way around than me. Also, little pattern pieces. Like a lot of my patterns have small pattern pieces, and I don't know exactly how those are secured if they're rolled up. I'd be worried about them falling out. So that's something to consider as well. And then similar to my system, I've seen some people keep all their patterns in a binder, and instead of having like files, like I have files, they put them in like those clear sheet cover protectors and fold everything up in that way. So then it's kind of like a book and you can flip through all your patterns, and then they can also keep like notes about the patterns and whatnot all in the binder. I feel like that's a kind of cute idea. So those are some options of how to store your patterns, but really it's up to you, however it's most convenient for you. The last thing I want to talk about is possibly the most exciting thing in my opinion, which is, okay, now I know what sewing patterns are, I know how to cut them, I know what the markings mean, I know what's included, I'm on board, I want to try out some patterns. How do I find good patterns? What are some good beginner patterns? So first of all, to answer how do you find good patterns in general? When I first started venturing into patterns instead of just self-drafting and making up my own stuff, I found Instagram to be super duper helpful because not only can you find pattern designers on Instagram and like follow them and kind of like stay up to date with what patterns they have, see examples, whatever. You can also use tags and hashtags to see all the different types of people who have made that pattern. So if you're looking at a pattern, you like it, but you're wondering what it would look like on you, on Instagram, most sewing patterns have their own hashtag. And if you click on that hashtag, you can see a ton of people who have made that garment and you can kind of get an idea of how it might fit you, or like different hacks people have done, different fabrics they've done it in, just like getting ideas and inspiration. It's so much fun. So in the description, I am going to link a bunch of pattern designers and pattern design companies that I would recommend checking out, following, getting inspiration from. There are so many good ones. I'm sure I'm gonna forget some. So in the comments, if you have ones that I've forgotten, please add your favorites in the comments. I feel like especially now, there are so many like indie pattern designers like me who are kind of just like a one-person business who are creating things that they love and providing those designs to other people. It's really exciting and fun. So yeah, there are just a billion good pattern designers out there. And I believe all the ones I'm linking are pretty size inclusive. If not every single one I link, almost all of them. I know for me, size inclusivity is something that's really important and something that has been historically an issue in sewing patterns is that they have not been very size inclusive. So like I said earlier, I have an 18 size range, which goes from size 0 to 34, and size 34 is up to a 61-inch bust, a 54-inch waist, and a 65-inch hip. So I try to be as inclusive as possible, and I fit test all of my patterns on every single size to make sure that they're fitting all of the different bodies how they are intended to fit. So check out that list I'm including. I'm gonna link their Instagrams instead of their websites, mostly because I find Instagram to be a lot more helpful than websites sometimes when I'm deciding what I want to get. I can really kind of get a feel for all of the stuff they have, what their vibe is, if I want to follow and whatever. So you can like start following a few, kind of dip your toe into the world of pattern makers, and then that can kind of help you hone in on what specific patterns you want to make. You can also just Google sewing patterns. There are a lot out there. I feel like that's harder for me to get a gauge of if I actually want to make a pattern or not. And Etsy also has a lot of great patterns in their database that you can search up on Etsy as well. And if you really want to go nuts, there is an app that is somewhat new called Threadloop, and it's a place where you can keep track of all your sewing patterns, your projects you're working on. You can keep track of your fabric there. You can get inspiration from other people's patterns, see reviews. It's kind of like a mecca for sewing, and it just got out of beta testing. And so, like I said, it's kind of new. They're updating it and improving it all the time, but it's really cool. So I will link the Threadloop Instagram as well. I've gotten on it and like browsed around, but I haven't like really gone all in and like uploaded all the fabric I have and the patterns I have and all that stuff. So that's kind of a fun resource if you're like a super analytical person, or even if you just want to browse patterns there, it's a good resource. Okay, so as far as what pattern you should start with if you are a beginner, first of all, if you have literally never sewn anything ever and you're following this series as a beginner, I would recommend before you jump into a pattern, first just doing at least one project that gets you used to just like using your machine and some basic terminology. So the project that we are going to do next week in episode 5 is going to be perfect for that. It'll be a beginner project, cover all the bases, get you used to sewing, and from there you will be very well set up to follow a beginner sewing pattern. I also have a skirt tutorial that is very beginner friendly. I've had a bunch of people tell me it's the first thing they ever made and that they were able to follow it and that it was helpful for them. So I'll link that as well if you want to make a skirt. Like I said, I think we're doing a tote bag in episode 5. So if you'd rather do a skirt than a tote bag, it's probably slightly more adventurous, but I believe in you, you can totally do it. And then once you are ready for a pattern, my biggest piece of advice is to choose a pattern that you are actually excited about. And I think there's enough options that you absolutely can find one. I don't want you to choose a pattern based on what you think will be easiest. Because I think if you choose something that you're actually excited about and you think is actually cute, even if it looks a little bit adventurous, you will be more motivated to finish it. And I promise you, it will be easier than you think it's going to be. So definitely choose something that you are excited about. Patterns have ratings on them. Usually it's like beginner, intermediate, advanced. I very rarely see advanced patterns. So most of the ones that you'll come across will either be beginner or intermediate. I have rated all of my patterns confident beginner because I really think any beginner can pretty much do them as long as you feel like confident and motivated to do it. Especially because I feel very confident in my instructions, but also with the accompanying video tutorials, I very much believe that pretty much any skill level can do them. So any of my patterns are good ones to start out with if you want to make them. I would say in order of easiness to most difficult, even though they're all very easy. My lane pants are probably the easiest, especially since there are elements that are optional, like there's cargo pockets, but you don't have to do them, they're optional. There's a drawstring, but you can skip that. So if you just make the most basic version of the pants, it's a very easy project. So the lane pants are probably the easiest. And then I would say the skyline dress, which is this top that I'm wearing, hacked from the dress pattern. That's probably my second easiest. And then the ruby vest and my Sid tie top and dress probably have the most tricky elements to them, but it's still, like I said, they're all still rated confident beginner. So you could start with any of mine if you want to. No pressure. If you hate them, you don't have to do them. But a couple other ones that come to mind from other pattern designers. There is the Jill skirt, which is a wrap skirt from Jessie Lou's Closet. I own that pattern and I've made that pattern. It's very quick, very easy. It has some good like techniques to it that I think would help you in your sewing journey, but nothing difficult. And Jess, the designer, great designer, she has actually coached me a lot in my pattern making. And so I totally trust her instructions, her tutorials. She's great. So that one comes to mind. The ginger tie top. I wore that actually a couple videos ago. I own that one. I've made that pattern. It's very simple, very easy, and similar to the Jill skirt. I feel like there are a couple elements to it that are kind of cool and like simple and easy enough that you can absolutely do them, but they'll make you feel like, ooh, I'm like sewing cool stuff, you know? So that one would be a good beginner project. And then another one that I have not made myself personally, but I see a lot of people make is the collage gather top from Matchy Matchy Sewing Club. It's like a basic tee with a spin, sort of. It looks super simple. I know it's rated good for beginners. I've seen, like I said, tons of people make it, so I feel like that's a testament to the pattern. I imagine it has good instructions and all of that stuff. So those are 3 options if you're looking for other beginner sewing ideas. But like I said, all of the people I've tagged in the description, you can go look at their patterns and kind of see what floats your boat and just pick something that is rated beginner and looks like it'll be fun, and I think you'll be fine. So hopefully you now feel quite comfortable with sewing patterns, or if you were comfortable with them before, hopefully you learned a couple things or got a couple tips from this video. But I also want to put a huge plug in for hacking and altering sewing patterns. Obviously you chose the pattern for its original form or design, and that's great, but I find that I end up hacking my patterns that I buy a ton, or even the patterns that I make, because once you have kind of like a base of go-to patterns, you can hack them into such a wide variety of other garments. For example, my lane pants, the ones I'm actually wearing right now, I'll put a picture so you can see better. But I was seeing all of these cute like wide leg ruffle pants everywhere, and I thought they'd be so much fun to make, but I didn't need to redraft an entire pattern. I can just use the base of the lane pants and kind of alter them and hack them a little bit to add a ruffle to the bottom, right? So as you're getting inspiration for things to make, as you're pinning things on Pinterest, I challenge you to kind of think through the patterns you already have, how you can hack them into new versions or versions that you like even more than the originals. And with that, I am extremely excited about episode 5 and the fun project we are going to make, and that we actually get to sew for the first time in this series. So I hope you will come back for that one, and I will see you then.